So thank you, Ulrika. Good afternoon, good evening to everyone, and once more, thank you for this kind invitation. It's great for me to be again here in the meeting organized by IRENA. As you mentioned, the just transition actually is the key phrase in Poland whenever we speak about this energy transformation. It's extremely important, and in our opinion, actually, this is the only way where we can first conduct this transformation, second, convince others, or actually convince people in Poland that it makes sense, that it is beneficial for everyone. And without this transition, without this just transition, without these social aspects, there are actually no megawatts, as you mentioned. There may be some at the beginning, but at some point there would be a huge backlash and protest against those developments. And why actually do we emphasize so much on this energy transition in Poland? On this just energy transition, it's actually the fact that we have quite unique situation because we still are, but in the past we were heavily dependent on the coal. Actually, during this old times before 1990s, coal was the only option that we had in Poland, and a lot of generation fleet was built at that time. And right now, actually, we face interesting situation because it's not that we do implement renewables, but there are two reasons. First, we actually have to, because the whole generation that was built in 70s, 80s, it's getting old. It needs to be replaced, and nowadays renewables are the only cost-effective option, or one of the few, because we actually consider development of nuclear energy as well. But the other reason is actually the prevailing one, that's our awareness about climate change, about all the consequences of not getting or not taking any actions, is really at high level in Poland, and there is a growing support. But to make this support even wider, to make this acceptance even wider, we initiated the whole agenda of just transition. And as you mentioned, it's not only Katowice, it's not only that declaration, but we also do raise this issue within the European Union discussions, and we are in this dialogue with the European Commission to make sure that there are special funds for those regions that are in difficult position. But the other thing is that we do our homework, and we conducted several activities. We've been conducting several activities to make sure that this transition is possible. One element of our efforts is the one you mentioned, so the kind of dialogue with mining sector. The sectoral agreement that we signed just few weeks ago, it was a big milestone for us. As you know, or as you may know today, there is still sizable number of miners in Poland. It's around 80,000 of people, plus around 400,000 of people who are indirectly connected with that sector. And it took us a lot. It took our politicians a lot to make sure that both sides can somehow meet at some point and agree that coal would be phased out, that coal mining sector would be closed down in 2049, and that those people would have comfort that first of all they would know what's happening with their lives, that they have secured lives, that they have jobs, retirements, and job opportunities in the future, but also that their kids, their families have bright future, because in many of those regions, actually, this is a tradition that son after father after grandfather works in a mine and doesn't see any other future. So this is one part of the story. But the other part of the story is how to actually create those jobs in the sector that refers to the energy transformation. Recently, 5 months ago, we have adopted a new energy strategy by 2040. In this strategy, we envisage that our share of renewables would grow by 23% in 2030 and 28% in 2040. Just for comparison, today it's 12%. But in the electricity sector, this rise would be even higher, because in 10 years, 1/3 of electricity would come from renewables already. And here, onshore wind, offshore wind, solar PV would be the dominant technologies. And as a result of that energy transformation, we do believe that we will create more than 300,000 of jobs. So this is already a significant number, a number that brings attention and actually shows those sectors that would lose on the energy transformation, that there is a room for this sector as well, for these people. And where would those jobs be allocated? So first of all, we have initiated our offshore wind agenda. So we prepared a law that would envisage creation of 6 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030 and 11 gigawatts by 2040. And within that sector, we do believe that more than 70,000 of jobs would be created. It's not only components, but all the other aspects, as you mentioned in your presentation, related to all the legal services, advertisement, and services around installation. The other aspect is photovoltaics. We've been observing in Poland, I would call it revolution. We call it actually a revolution in Poland, because just within 2 years, from almost like 500 megawatts of installed capacity, we end up at 4 gigawatts of capacity in 2020. So just within 1 year, in 2020, the additional installed capacity was more than 2 gigawatts. So that's something that we even haven't anticipated. We did bet on PV, but we didn't. We were not convinced that actually our society will be so much interested in that. And in fact, saying our society, I want to emphasize that actually our prosumers, so households, are those who drive this development mostly. So more than 70% of our solar PV is rooftop PV. And why I'm saying about this? Because actually within just 2-3 years, more than 20,000 jobs was created in that sector. Number of companies was established, and they do provide several services now, not only with PV, but also with heat pumps, with storage, and all the energy-related issues. And there is one more component. I know that I'm taking a lot of the time, but I really want to share this the most up-to-date example. So we have last year initiated something what we call sector deals. We signed a letter of intent with offshore industry, with biogas industry, with solar PV industry, and hydrogen industry. And our goal within this collaboration is to sign a sector deal with all of those industries, where in sector deal on the one side you have involved a government, you have involved investors, but also research, academia, and all other entities that are of interest in that sectors. And we do believe that through that collaboration, we would develop a sector deal that we hope to stick to in the future, not only government, but also other sides. And in that deal, we would have 2 key components. First is how to ensure that the local that economic benefits of the development are ensured, and on the one side, the government would make sure that policies are right, but also all the investors would commit that they would try to use Polish local content on that development. And the other part of that deal would be how to make sure that in general we have conducive frameworks for development of that technology, to make sure that this period up to 2030, 2040 is encouraging for investors to develop even more of renewables. So perhaps I will end here at this point, and I'm happy to continue later if there are any further questions.
maybe you can have a discussion with Hector afterwards on the cost effectiveness of nuclear, actually. But no, that was really interesting, and I'm always interested to see and hear the success stories also. And the PV story reminds me of Germany a couple of years ago, actually, where we had this boom phase of photovoltaics, which was also driven by a lot of private residents, people who just put PV on their roof. So speaking about Germany, that makes me turn to Tobias. And the question for Tobias is a bit different. I mean, you are working on the aspects that different scenarios are possible to reach the target, the 1.50 target, with different combinations of technologies, and efficiency. And you are more looking in that research at the footprint, basically, the life cycle footprint, or the life cycle, doing the life cycle assessment of these different pathways. What is your opinion? What would you like to share from this research?
Well, thanks first of all for the invitation, and hello to everyone here and in the audience. Yeah, this question is I could speak for an hour, but I tried to do it in a very few minutes.
We are good on time, because I was so quick. So just share your view.
So yes, in general, I mean, one of the first important messages is probably that the more renewable our systems get, the less important, obviously, is the direct technology that produces the energy, but the more important the pre-chains, the supply chains, the life cycle gets. And that brings completely new environmental issues on the agenda. If you think of biofuels, you have a lot of issues associated with land use, with biodiversity, with use of fertilizers, which leads to eutrophication and things like that. If you think of, let's say, something more conventional than like hydropower, you have also, if you think of large dams, you have biodiversity impact that are crucial. If you think of PV or wind power, you have the use of scarce metals and minerals. You also have, if you go to the social dimension, you of course also have acceptance issues and things like that. So there is a whole range of indicators and topics that are all related to sustainability, and many to ecological or environmental sustainability, which matter. And what we found in our research is we looked at various scenarios from other institutions that already forecasted what will happen when we have an energy transition, and we compared those according to a whole set of sustainability indicators. And it's very interesting that the environmental impacts far apart from CO2 can vary quite a lot. So you can actually have very ambitious CO2 scenarios with almost no CO2 left, which cause quite heavy environmental impacts in other dimensions, or you can also have those with much lower environmental impacts in other dimensions. So one important takeaway is that it's not only the reduction of CO2, that for sure is necessary, also from an ecological point of view, but it's also the way how we get there. So how do we best mix the different technologies in order to have a sustainable outcome, and not just a climate-friendly outcome, but also one that takes care of biodiversity and so forth. So that is, without quoting any numbers, but that is very much for sure. Yeah, and the other thing is, I think that we have to work even more on the efficiency side. Ulrike, you mentioned energy efficiency as an important aspect on the demand side, but it goes beyond, not just beyond megawatt, but also beyond energy efficiency, because we have to tackle the issue of material and resource efficiency, not on the issue, but also on the demand side. Because when you think of inefficient use of materials, then this also means a lot of energy usually that is required, and this increases the energy demand. So there's a whole life cycle and a whole system that needs to be considered. And maybe I stop here, but there will definitely be follow-up questions.
Also, because the quality was a little bit, you were a little bit, not the quality of what you said, but the quality of the transmission was a little bit.
Okay, sorry for that.
It did something a little bit funny. It kind of speeded up your talk to make up for the gaps, but maybe in the second round, the quality will be a little bit better. Yeah. And with this, I turn to Hector. Hector, you are behind the numbers that I have been showing here. But now this is your chance to say what from this work, but also from all the other work you are doing, obviously. What do you think beyond the megawatt? What is the indicator that you see as most important, and which narratives and policy landscapes beyond the numbers matter most for the energy transition?
Thanks, Ulrika. Thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm not sure if I should interpret the question as was my presentation a good job of presenting the results or not. But you'll be pleased that there's not going to be much disagreement on my side. Yeah, so as someone that works with macroeconomic models, obviously we get large numbers of outputs from this, and it's part of the job of the economist to create the narrative, the story from those results, and pull out what's most important. Traditionally, there's always been a focus on GDP. Now this is where ears of economists and people that work in finance ministries, they prick up, and everyone that's not an economist rolls their eyes and is talking about GDP again. There are good reasons for that, historical reasons. If we rewind a couple of centuries, GDP, the amount that we produce, was linked to, when we lived a more subsistence lifestyle, the amount of food we produced, and therefore our chances of survival, it was that important. But at least in the developed world now, we have moved on from that. GDP is no longer our chances of survival. It's how much stuff we produce, basically. And over time, what's become more important is the distribution of that income and wealth. So when I, as a consultant, talk to policymakers, typically what it comes down to is number of jobs. And we've heard Ulrika presented on jobs. Martin talked quite a lot about jobs in Poland. This is, I suppose, the indicator of the number of people that are not left behind, the employed people. And jobs often is the number one in the, and sometimes policymakers will just say, tell us how many jobs, forget about all the other numbers, it's just how many jobs is going to come out of this, preferably a positive number, of course, and preferably in the short-term electoral cycle as well. But yeah, what does that mean? I mean, unlike GDP, where you double it, you get twice the same thing, jobs are not identical, and they vary across sectors, skills, locations, types of work. So it's not just a question of aggregating them together. I mean, having that headline number is important, but there's a much richer story beneath that of what types of jobs that are in there. And the modeling can help to some extent to show sectors on that, but there's a lot more qualitative analysis that needs to be done around that. Now, the second part of the question, how does that fit with the narratives? I mean, economists and modelers in particular have done a really good job of creating a really bad narrative that climate policy always entails costs, and the job of the policymaker is to minimize those costs. Now, that, as much as anything, reflects the assumptions that the economists have made in their models, and it can be a very misleading story. There are costs to some people, some groups in society. There is stuff that needs to be paid for, of course, but there is also opportunity there as well, and investment creating those opportunities. And the types of jobs involved, manufacturing of equipment, of course, but I think just as importantly, and often forgot about, installation, which has to be done locally. And that can be quite a labor-intensive exercise. Now, in the short term, going through an energy transition, there will be a lot of investment, which will create a lot of jobs around that. That's a story that I think most people, the average person on the street, can understand. Longer term, it's a bit more less tangible, because we start to talk about moving from an energy-intensive economy to a labor-intensive economy. Again, people go, "Oh, that's just economists talking about stuff." But these are more the permanent impact, which I think are just as important in all of this. But we should see more jobs being created, and in general, decent jobs as well. So I think picking out the narratives from that, we then get to the question about what are the policies that you need to do all of this, and that's a separate question entirely. But it all feeds into this question about distribution of impacts. I mean, overall, we talk about GDP, we saw positive impacts in Ulrika's slide. They could be negative, they could be positive. Most of our results say positive, but it's not a big change either way. There's not going to be countries suddenly becoming really rich or really poor out of all of this. It's really about the distribution within that that counts, and that's both between countries and within countries. I think those are the real hard questions that we could all do a bit better in addressing.
Yeah, thank you. That gives me not only a lot of insight. Oh, we got Tobias back. Not only a lot of insight, but also a really good transition to our next panelist, because of course the energy transition, the socio-economic impacts, and just an inclusiveness is just not complete without the access discussion. And without just looking at the concerns of around 800 million people who don't have access to modern energy as of yet. And of course, that is also a distribution question, but it's also a question of identifying productive uses, of identifying additional benefits. And maybe, Sarah, you want to just share your views and insights on that.
Yeah, thanks, Ulrika, and of course, IRENA, for inviting me to this. I think when I hear the word energy transition, I think the word that keeps popping up in my mind is inclusive energy transition, right? So I think the whole thing around job creation, but also are there job creators? Are we creating opportunities for that? And I think how do we increasingly build domestic capacity to be problem solvers, right? And in our work, I think there are many levers, I think, of building that transition for, on the access issue. And it's a lot of things that have been spoken about in this entire conference, right? Whether it's finance, it's policy, it's, innovation, it's human resources, it's incubation. It's that ecosystem of things. But maybe the point that the one that I'd focus on more a little bit is around the skill building for this, because in this transition to some sort of a game changer and a different scenario that we want to look at, this thing of how do you build these local problem solvers? How do you get more ownership into the hands of people, not just as passive recipients, but also to actively be decision makers, in this entire sort of discussion. And so there's sort of two areas that we have worked on. One is from skilling from, I think, a technical and a non-technical side. And I think a lot of the skilling conversations tend to lean on the technical side, where we know that, and I think Martin and Hector and Tobias sort of spoke about that as well. There's this, you look at the solar PV value chain, right from procurement, all the way to installation, operation, maintenance. You need that sort of, those sort of skilled technicians in there. But what we're also seeing, especially in the field that we work, a lot around innovation, whether that is storage solutions, mobility solutions, whether that's around appliances related to livelihoods, related to healthcare. That sort of, skilling around developing a lot of these innovations is what is something that we see is needed. Some of the regions we work with, they're accessible only by water. they're, high up in the mountains. I mean, when you're talking of battery storage, when you're talking of mobility, even what we've seen in COVID, the sort of door-to-door sort of health services that is needed, you need to be able to retrofit ambulances, vans, you need to be able to have almost like a health clinic in a box, right? And I think that sort of innovation around that thinking, around appliances, around productive use, we talk of rice hulling at 10 HP machines, and really what you need is a 0.5 HP machine or a 1 HP machine, and be able to source those components and those parts within the country itself. So I think that whole skilling around and building that domestic ability to be able to do these innovations, I think, is one thing that our work is sort of centered around, and I think is very much needed in this. The other part around the non-technical aspect, to be able to do that, all that innovation and all of this, the technical side of things, you need, you need what I mentioned as job creators. We're increasingly seeing an appetite for local entrepreneurship. People not only in the cities, but even coming out of vocational training institutes. I want to solve an issue in my backyard. So being able to create, an enabling environment for those entrepreneurs is another key lever that will push, I think, the technical side as well. Financing. It's something we talk about so much that we need to unlock domestic financing. You're still talking to financiers who are very risk averse. It's not just the oiling on the demand side, it's also the oiling on the supply side, and also the variety of financiers that are out there. You have cooperatives, you have MFIs, you have non-banking financial corporations. I mean, there are many sort of different types of financial institutions and intermediaries that can come into this conversation, not just commercial banks. So how are we sort of working with them to even sort of change those mindsets and increase that appetite? Another thing is around energy audits. I think it can be something that can be seen as extremely technical and very high level, but we have worked with a lot of with partners in sort of urban slums, for example, looking at how do you look at energy audits of these sort of very close spaces, 300 square feet, 400 square feet. How do you look at better lighting, better ventilation? How do you train local community members to do that? So it's almost like demystifying, I think, this entire thing of when we talk of energy transition and construction and buildings and whatnot. It's even just when we talk of the access issue, when we were talking of people who live in houses where you forget putting a light in there or productive use appliance. I mean, there is no ventilation. The heating component of it is incredibly high. So how are we looking at, even from that point of view, empowering local energy auditors? And then finally, I think this entire conversation, I think, yes, we need to speak. When we talk about a lot of this, it's on the energy side, but I think a lot of our work is also centered around working with the livelihood sector partners and the health partners. So how are you working with organizations whose entire mandate is around livelihoods, and where are they getting that thought process that, just as, in my budgets and in my planning, I need to be thinking of decentralized renewable energy solutions as a critical input to my work being moved forward. So we are increasingly working with livelihood partners, health partners, and saying, okay, what do you need? What kind of appliance do you need? What kind of solution do you need? And how do you integrate that thinking into that NGO or that, that partner themselves? So I think that sort of, we use the word institutionalization in Selco a lot, but I think it's nothing more than integration into that sort of cross-sector sort of thinking. So yeah, I mean, I think that sort of, I think from a skilling side, I think the pieces that we see, if we're going to talk of this transition, then we need to kind of bring in that sort of capacitation and right kind of skilling into this mix. And then finally, I think the policy levers to be able to do this, one of the things that I think can really kickstart is having more, because we work in other countries as well. In India, we have this Atal Innovation Mission, which is very much centered around driving local innovation, and it's mandated by the government of India. I think having more of those central level support mandates to decentralize, enable state governments or provincial governments to look at more innovation centers, entrepreneurship centers, incubation of incubators, I think is something that I think will really sort of move the needle. Similarly with financing, creating more targets for for financial institutions internally in countries saying X% of your lending portfolio needs to be towards a priority sector. And it needs to be towards decentralized renewable energy, and it needs to be access oriented. I think we've seen wins there as well. So I think, all of this is possible, but yes, there is that policy component as well, and there are some shifts in that.
Yeah, Sarah, thank you. I really love the demystifying part, for instance. I mean, that is something that we sometimes it's always, like the big, large concepts and the big, large numbers. And then when you come to the ground, basically, then it is very straightforward solutions, basically, that you need to address. So that is something I'll definitely reuse if you let me do so. But then I was surprised also, we are having now a small second round, and I would kindly ask you to kind of aim for 2 minutes per contribution. And I I thought it was interesting and surprising to see how what Sarah said feeds to what Martin also might be saying about reskilling, about picking up on existing skills, for the just transition, and on policies. And maybe you can share a little bit the policy gaps, but focusing also on skills and education and training and capacity building. Would that be possible? And you need to unmute, Martin.
Sorry, I wasn't aware it's a question to me.
To you, yeah. I'm starting
Okay, no worries. That's fine. Yeah, actually, the reskilling part is a key component in the transition, and you need to improve the basic education programs and that are at universities, at colleges, and so on, to make sure that all those young people who would enter the labor market, that they would actually have all those competences needed in the energy transformation issue. But the question is what to do with those who are already very experienced with many years of employment in other sectors. And you can have two kind of answers. The number one is that actually, especially in the lignite sector, that is also quite important in Poland, that you have actually quite many engineers, people who are well educated, who would be easily able to move to another branch of energy sector, let's say, to be employed. The question is whether they would be willing to do so, because in many cases, it's actually that those jobs, those places are concentrated, and people have been living there for years, and there are not so many other options around. So even if they are willing and able to reskill, there is still no place to work for. So that's why actually in our case, whenever we discuss about new jobs and new companies building manufacture capacities on batteries or anything else, we try to locate it in areas actually in a Silesia region, so where those people can easily move to another places to work on without affecting the private personal lives. And there is another part of that story, that not everyone could be reskilled, so the retirement programs need to be also put in place. And the less percentage of retirement, the more percentage of reskilling, the better, of course. But I would assume, judging on what we've been experiencing in Poland, 100% of reskilling is unfortunately impossible, but this is something what we emphasize on when we prepare these transformation plans for every region. So this reskilling part is a key component and required component to make that happen.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, But jobs are not only about money, of course, as you see, and that's it's about much more. And the energy transition is not only about jobs, Tobias. Now you have to make a stand for materials and for the other impacts that are also really important, so that we do not regret any pathway that we took. So what could policies or the political governments just do to address the issue of materials and the issue of the footprint better?
Well, yeah. In general, I think we need more holistic assessments and those to be used for the actual decision. So the assessment alone never helps. So it has actually something has to be based on that. And I think in this regard, we need a better operationalization, is that the right term? Anyway, and a better execution of things like the Sustainable Development Goals. So we really need to have more measurable metrics for even decisions within energy systems and so forth. And also we need to, and I think Sarah pointed out, and Marcin as well, we need more participation, stakeholder engagement, things like that. But I think if I repeat all this, I'm very much preaching to the converted here. So I would like to maybe highlight one further aspect beyond just a smooth transition. From an ecological point of view, we really need a fast transition. It's not much time anymore. So it's not only about being smooth, but it's really about being fast. And the fast transition will definitely require huge efficiency efforts, because otherwise our ever-increasing energy demand will counteract the good efforts to make the energy system more environmental friendly. So we also and definitely need more action on issues such as resource efficiency, circular economy, material efficiency in industries, but also in households, and without necessarily having less benefit. So just a very quick example, if you think of traffic systems, nowadays it's individual traffic. If we have a shared mobility and then a much better public transportation, we will reduce direct energy demand a bit, but we will have much less vehicles, much less road needed. And if we do that, we need less material for that. And then finally, again, less energy. I'm sure that the economists will not all be happy with what I'm saying, but these are really like resource efficiency efforts that would have huge effect on the energy demand side, and that will help a rapid transition, not just a smooth transition.
Thanks, Tobias. And we can just ask the economist, actually, if he's happy with all these new challenges. I mean, we heard about cross-sectoral activities, about innovation, about using less material, using less, what is happening, Hector, to our good economic models? Are you happy about the suggestion of more efficiency and more use less materials?
Yeah. So speaking as an economist, I am allowed to criticize economists in general. So the economists do love efficiency. You can't get away from that. They also love models, and unfortunately, the models often go in rather misleading directions. I mean, personally, I am very, very much on board. I think just the question I ask is how to make it happen. What are the policies that you need to put in place to do that? And here, I think just caution talking to the economists, because the economists will just say some kind of price on something, which we know is not the way to do it in the real world. What we need to do is come up with a system which is comprised of policies that work together, and the interaction between these policies is important for driving innovation and the different stages of innovation and social change as well. And for that, and especially given the speed that we need to do this at, I think we need to look for all the different tools that we have to make it happen. And yeah, let economists feed into that conversation, but they should not be dominating it.
Thanks. Yeah. And then Sarah, you pretty much have the last word before me on this panel. You already shared a lot of views on the different aspects and what is necessary. So if you only have very few sentences, what would you say? What is the let's say the most important policies that you see, and government, maybe NGO interaction, that could bring us closer to, for instance, 100% access, as the veto says?
Yeah, I think somewhere, I think Tobias mentioned it, we need not just smooth, but rapid transition. And I think to be able to do that, somewhere I think we wait sometimes for the right policies to come along. And that seems to be, when you ask anybody, what is that challenge? Everyone says, policy is a challenge. Yes, it is a challenge. But I think that, one is to just sort of, plug in these high-risk monies that is needed, go out there and just implement. I think what we have seen when people talk of policies as well, again, to demystify this, that it need not be a national policy, right? Like policy can be a circular in a financial institution about their mandate and their target to prioritize funding towards better, built environment structures, materiality, and livelihood solutions. Policy can be a vocational training institute association, sort of saying, we're going to have these kinds of courses, put out there for our students. So I think you can decentralize policy making and therefore, move a little faster, and we don't need to wait for national level policy, global level policy. I think it would help move things, but I don't think we necessarily, I think it should happen in parallel, but not have that as, if that only happens, then I will do step 2, 3, and 4. So I think what we've seen is that sort of nimble kind of decentralized policy decision-making, provincial, regional, more line agencies, government line agencies, having more power, devolution of power to act, I think, and to unlock monies, I think has been a game changer. And I will tell you, in COVID, we did a lot of work around livelihood and just resilient, just trying to help people to build back. The critical success factor for us was we were able to work with local government agencies, we didn't have to wait for the central government. There was money, devolved power and decision-making that was allowed there for us to act fast. So I think that I think would be my takeaway: decentralized decision-making and policy-making as sort of a lever to faster transition.
Yeah, thanks for that. Thanks a lot. So what I take away from this is actually something that is in the foreword of the veto, which is the time is now. That's how this World Energy Transition Outlook starts. And I think the urgency and the fact that we should act now is something that I heard from most of your contributions. From most of your contributions, I also heard a stress of the relevance of dialogue, participation, and distributional aspects. So I think even to the material realm, the dialogue and the inclusion of all the actors and trying to drive this forward, that makes a lot of sense also to create a more material efficient and energy efficient world. So with this, I think we are at the end of this. The only thing that is left for me is thank you for your time. Thank you for your inspiring inputs. Thank you for joining me. And I hope we'll see progress jointly. We jointly see progress in our different fields of the energy transition.